This is Unto the End. So it's a 2D side-scrolling action game that you can now get across most platforms. If you do have Xbox Game Pass for PC or Microsoft Game Pass for PC, I would recommend trying it out there because, of course, you don't have to pay for it if you already have the subscription. And the other platforms such as Steam, well, it really depends if this is your sort of game because it isn't exactly cheap for what it is. I wouldn't say it's expensive either. It's kind of within the right range. But yeah, it does depend on if this is your sort of thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly how this compares to other games of this type. So the first thing you want to see is basically it gives you this message in terms of this game's different. You need to set aside any expectations or assumptions. Combat's deliberate. You can lose your sword, run out of supplies, and bleed to death. It is a very tough game. I think the reason why they've put that message up there is just because of how difficult this game can be to play at times. I'm going to talk a little bit about the combat and what I think about that, but I do first want to talk about the good stuff. And the first thing is the art style itself and the sound design. So I do like this art style. It kind of reminds me of The Long Dark, which is one of my favorite games of all time, particularly because of the nice art style of The Long Dark. And this is almost like a 2D version of that. And there are a couple of these 2D side-scrolling games with really nice art styles, things such as Far Lone Sails or Inside. I really like these sorts of games where it is 2D, but they've really put a lot of effort into the visuals, and particularly in this case as well, the sound design. So the visuals are quite good. It's not the most interesting that I've seen in terms of these sorts of games, but it is really beautiful in its own sort of simplistic way. What I do really like though is the sound design. So if you're playing this game with a headset on, that's where a lot of the immersion comes from. And one of the categories that I specifically want to look at for this channel are games that are good in immersion, and this is particularly why I like this game. Now, that said, I don't like everything about the game, and I do think that the weaker part of the game, or maybe I shouldn't say weaker, just the thing that could potentially make it difficult for some players to get into it would be the combat. And I think this is the part that's controversial because other games have done this sort of thing before. There's a game called Bannerman, if you have tried that before, that is very similar in terms of its approach to combat. It's also quite deliberate and quite challenging. But I do think that if I had to compare this to Bannerman, this would be the more challenging game of the two. And I think where it gets controversial, so I'm okay with the fact that it is difficult. I don't think everybody is going to be okay with that. But the one thing that I don't like about the combat is that when you die in a particular encounter, you have to go back to a checkpoint. And sometimes there are these little animations in between that keeps you from getting back into the fight really quickly. And the problem with doing that is if you think about really tough action games, things such as Super Meat Boy, what the developers very deliberately do in those games is they let you get back into the action really fast. So after you die, you can basically replay that section almost immediately. And I think that's very important because if you are playing a game where the combat is so challenging that you can basically die 5 or 10 times in a row, or have to spend an hour on a particular section to try and get that right. And I do think this game can be that difficult in certain cases. Then that can be a bit problematic. And that's the one thing that I think the developers should have done differently. But what you're about to see here is the first encounter where you can actually, so when you get to a fire, you can heal your wounds and you can also do training to basically do some sparring and work out how the combat works. And this is great. I'm glad that they did add this into the game because, as I said, the combat is challenging, and I think without this section, it would make it even more brutal. So this will basically teach you all of the different elements, step by step, just explaining what you can do. So you usually have your sword. You can use that to do high and low attacks. You can block high and low. You can fake high and low and use that to catch your opponents off guard. You have a dagger as well, which you can throw and then pick up, or you can stab if you're close to the opponent. You can do shoulder checks like this as well. So there are quite a few things in the combat. And as I said, it's nice that they have this section because once you start getting into the game, and you start getting into the actual combat encounters, you really don't have much opportunity to learn. Of course, you will still continue to get better at it, but it can be incredibly punishing. So what you'll see here is they're basically teaching the basics. You can see that you need to block high if the person is aiming high. Of course, that's going to get a lot tougher as you start getting into the game. Here, deliberately, they do give you a lot of time to react, just for you to be able to learn how it works. And then you can sort of use what's happening in the combat dynamically to decide how you need to react to the opponent. And it's really all about just, as they say, remaining calm, focusing on what the opponent is doing, and reacting accordingly. The thing is, though, that if you do get it wrong in actual combat, it is incredibly punishing, and it can basically get to the point where it just takes one or two hits from the opponent to completely take out your character, which will then send you back to the previous checkpoint. So what I've seen happen is sometimes if the opponent lands one blow, it's okay, and you can continue the combat, and if you make it through that, you'll be okay. But in some cases, if you're, for example, say blocking low and the opponent hits high, that one shot could be enough to either completely knock you off balance and the opponent will land another shot that'll kill you right there and then, or in some cases, even if they don't land the second shot, you can be bleeding so much that even after winning the encounter, you'll just bleed out and die anyway. And that's where the really challenging part of this game comes in, because the opponents are more powerful than you are. They can take several hits. I think, even the starting opponents probably take 4 or 5 hits to go down. Whereas, as I said, for you, it could be 1 or 2 hits. And the way in which the difficulty curve on this game ramps up is also a little bit crazy. You start with the first, so after you do this training section, there's one opponent that you face that doesn't actually have a weapon, so it's just an opponent that fights with its bare hands, essentially. That encounter is incredibly easy. Even if you don't do a really good job, you'll still win that encounter. When you get to the next encounter, you basically get three opponents. So the first one is already quite difficult, and you'll die most likely several times just trying to beat that one opponent. And even if you do beat him, you then have two other opponents coming in, which you have to fight at the same time. So it really does escalate quickly. And again, people will look at this in different ways. Some people will really like it. They'll like the fact that the game is challenging and that you have to play that over and over again in order to get good at it. My point of view is a little bit different. I do think it's better if games ease you into that a little bit, and they maybe start you off with one opponent with a weapon, then maybe have a different section where you have two opponents with weapons so that you can get used to that scenario as well. And then, as I said, most important for me is that the game lets you get right back into the action, which here is definitely not the case. So unfortunately, I looked at Steam for the reviews on this as well, and it is getting mixed reviews. And I don't think it's because it's a bad game, because as I said, art style's good, audio design is really good. It's a really nice, immersive game, and it is. I wouldn't say it's completely unique. I've seen this sort of thing before, but it is just really good in terms of what it does, being a side-scrolling action game. I do think that the mixed reviews are coming from the fact that some players are just finding it difficult to get into this game, and they just don't feel that that difficulty curve is handled in the right way. And I wouldn't blame anybody for feeling that way with this particular game. It's always a challenging decision for the development team as well, because on the one hand, you want to stay true to the idea that you had for the original game and the experience that you wanted players to have. And I think that's why some games don't necessarily give you options in terms of how difficult the game is or how tough your character can be, and these sorts of little artificial adjustments that you can make to change how difficult it's going to be for any given person to get through the game. But this is also one of those things that you need to sort out through playtesting, and the developers got to make this decision. Do you want to stick to this really sort of hardcore, tough experience, which will definitely alienate some of the player base and will prevent some people from getting into the game and enjoying the game? Or do you want to be a little bit more flexible in that regard and maybe have different game modes? So, what a lot of games have done in the past is they would, for example, have the standard mode, which is how the developers intended the game to be played, and then you can have a game mode that is slightly less punishing, maybe where the character has slightly more health, something along those lines, which would have been an easy fix in this game. That's what I would have recommended in this case, is that they just have the two game modes, or you could phrase it differently as well. It could be the normal game mode, and you can have a hardcore mode, which is basically what the game is in its present state, where you can die very, very easily. So I think we should be coming up to the first combat encounter shortly. You also have to deal with traps such as this one, and that's why it reminds me of a lot of these sorts of games. The other one that I remember from a long time back was Flashback, which is also this sort of thing where you have these little adventuring sections where you have to do stuff like this. As you can see, I got it wrong here twice before figuring out that I actually had to jump out of the way before I could make my way across. So this is there with the combat. But I think that the main challenge, all of these things you will kind of figure out over time, but the main challenge will be coming from the combat. So by the way, there I had to pick up my torch again. And you can lose your torch and your sword. I think that's just another one of these sort of deliberate decisions that you have to pay attention to these things as you're playing the game. Uh, yeah, so this is the first combat encounter, and you'll see that this is unbelievably easy. If you think about the training that I just did, I don't think this creature can actually do much in the way of blocking. It took about 3 shots for me to take him down. And this is the first real combat encounter. Now, the next one, which we should get to within the next 2 minutes or so, is significantly harder. And I'll probably end the video there because this is just the first impression video. But yeah, this is the pace at which it ramps up, as I said, is really quite fast. And I also want you to take note of these little pauses in animation that you'll see as we get into this section. So when you get to this section, this is more or less where the save point is, right where my character is now. So that's where you're going to restart if you lose this combat encounter. And basically what you're seeing here are these little animation sequences that are happening. So you have to wait for that one enemy to do what he just did, and I have to wait for the second enemy to do that little bit, and then you can get into it. That's the problem, because this is not an easy fight sequence when you're playing this game for the first time, and unfortunately you are going to keep watching that same animation over and over again and run down that same corridor over and over again, and that's just not great. I think they should have just put you straight back into the action. But don't get me wrong, it is a good game, and I think if you are on Game Pass, you should definitely check it out, because it's not going to cost you any extra money. If you are on one of the other platforms, well, it depends if this is your sort of thing. But if you have played it, do let me know in the comments what you think. And as always, if you like this kind of content, do like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next video.